Okay, so welcome everybody to our first faculty and staff reading group. We're going to be discussing trigger warnings, also called content warnings, in secondary education, upper higher education. So so I'm going to just begin with a brief. I kind of summarized some of the main points that we can start beginning our talk. Um, so there is debate, right, with pros and cons. Should we, when we're teaching a course that might contain some text or images related to racism or sexual violence or any kind of trauma related topic, we want to make sure, like, could this cause potential harm or trauma or distress to our students? Should we give them a trigger warning? If so, should it be with only certain lectures? Should it be in the syllabus? Or should it even be just as a disclaimer in the beginning of a whole program that this could occur? Anybody have thoughts on that to start?
My first thought is to be safe, having an overall disclaimer certainly would cover all areas. In nursing, sometimes I feel like we almost have the okay to discuss about intimate kind of situations because that's what we'll be dealing with in our profession. I can give you a specific example. When I taught research, prior to looking out for the safety of the participants, there were some brutal research studies done years ago, and one or two of the videos depicted that, but there was just a brief statement prior to that, kind of forewarning students, and that's how I had dealt with it personally.
Mm-hmm. Did you?
I actually, this is a situation I deal with actually quite a bit in epidemiology and even somewhat in policy. And I've gotten into situations, one of our global health topics, we have a lot of topics that students can choose from that could potentially be triggers, one of which is rape, which is a week 6 global health issue. And I post in the Epi News and Information Forum the trailer to the video that actually Lady Gaga had sang about it in it's the trailer to The Hunting Ground, but Lady Gaga had sung about it in one of the Oscar award ceremonies a few years ago. And I always post a disclaimer because what it's talking about is rape on college campuses. And it's this short little video. It's not graphic in the fact that it shows anything terrible, but it's what it implies that could be a trigger. And I'm really sensitive to this because of my work with the number of women and men that I find out have had, PTSD as a result of terrible situations that occurred with them in their history, whether it's at home or even as adults or as children. And so even just, and that's part of trauma-informed care and trauma-responsive care, is to be aware that you never know what someone's been through. And I'm astounded even that some of our students share, like one of the questions we ask in their week 7 is, why did you select this topic? And some of them are very transparent about why they selected a topic from their own personal experience. And it's actually pretty riveting. I mean, I had a student who did a voice thread on suicide, and I'm standing here listening to this voice thread. In the voice thread, she said, the reason why I chose this topic is my husband committed suicide 2 years ago. And literally, I almost buckled at the knees just hearing that. So I'm one that says, if we think there could be anything, and I know I'm talking about a lot, but I will have one more thing I wanted to say, and that is, I have gun violence is also another topic. And Tammy and I were having a conversation. She she and I talked because she had a student that wanted to focus on police gun violence. And she said, do you think that's a good idea? And I said, absolutely not. Not now. You know, that's not a good topic to be talking about. And so I had a student that selected gun violence, and I felt to reach out to her and just say, please, you know, I think it would be wise to avoid the topic of police gun violence in you know, when you're discussing this topic. And I haven't heard back from her, and I'm sure she will. But I mean, gun violence in itself is a huge issue, but not to focus on police gun violence at this time. And now I'll shut up.
I have a couple of things that sort of jump to mind. I mean, when I was reading the articles, I think Jamie and I were just mentioning this to one another, that, you know, when you think about the one perspective of, are we being too gentle with people? And then on the flip side of that, what's the big deal about giving a trigger warning? I mean, I think it feels a little bit like, you know, I've got mixed feelings, because I think that we do want to be gentle. I'm not talking about academically gentle. I'm not talking about being academically aggressive either, but I mean, I think we want to treat our students well, but I do think that, you know, college is a place where we should be able to discuss really difficult topics. And I understand, Marguerite, like, we have to be cautious, because in the online classroom, there's not a good way, with the exception if you're speaking in VoiceThread, there's not a good way to intonate and express emotion in the written word. I mean, sure, can we read something that has an emotional content? Sure, but when students sometimes say things, they may not communicate it as well in the written form than they do, say, in speaking in VoiceThread. So I think that we do have to be careful, but I also, you know, I'm sort of, you know, sort of this dichotomy of talking about really difficult topics that impact people, because in a way, people suffering from gun violence, wherever it is at, whether it's with the law enforcement or the general population, are going to come into our care probably at some point or other, maybe depending on, you know, where you live in the world. But, you know, I used to teach a triage course in New York City, and I said the difference between being in New Jersey and New York City, when we talk about triage and gunshots, is yours is usually gang violence, and mine is usually miss the deer and hit each other, right? So there's a very different perspective in terms of, you know, how that violence has, you know, is it violence, or was it an accident, or, you know, whatever. But I think that, you know, I struggle with this, because I don't think it's a big deal. I think we could include something at maybe the beginning of the program. But I think that there's always going to be a risk that there's a topic. I mean, what if we're in patho talking about pediatric oncology and somebody has lost a child? Do they need a trigger warning because we're talking, there should be some anticipation that we're going to bump into difficult topics, while at the same time, I'm like, what's the big deal about, I don't mean big deal in terms of the student perspective, but from the faculty perspective, to put a trigger warning on, you know, on a course, or, you know, an acknowledgement probably doesn't take a lot of time or energy, you know, to do, or even in the syllabus, but students don't read the syllabus. So then sort of, you know, where do you put this, and how do you word it? You know, we may deal with difficult topics, or, you know, I don't know.
I really appreciated the one article, and I don't know which one it is now, and I'm sorry to not cite it properly, but one of the authors was talking about tags, and I liked that concept of sort of tagging. These are the potential issues that we will be addressing this week, and they may or may not be triggering for students, but just to have a general sense of like an overview. And I thought that was interesting from sort of a teaching perspective too. I don't teach, but as a student, that's helpful for me to get a sense, like a broad overview of, okay, these are the items that we will be talking about today. And then the other piece, I think it was in a different article that I really appreciated, was this sense of if students have some sort of, whether you call it trigger warning, content warning, tag, that actually helps them take control of their own education. And I thought that moved well within our constructivist philosophy in the program. There was some sort of connection there. And that was my initial takeaways. But yeah, I appreciate the nuance. I don't think that there's a clear answer here. At least from my perspective, there's a lot of things to consider, and it's certainly not a black and white type of issue.
One thing that I thought was interesting too was well, I didn't check the literature, but there is a paucity of research on the topic that if we are, whether we mandate or make it optional for faculty to apply trigger warnings in any way they see fit, you know, is it really benefiting students or is there a negative? Like the one comment where a student said, if I see a trigger warning, I'm going to drop the class. I'm not sure how common that would be.
So
You mute.
Sorry, I clicked the button again. But are we making our decision based on evidence? So that brings up another idea. You know.
I definitely think that whole piece about in the reading about the sort of the anticipatory trouble with content if there's a trigger warning on it, and maybe it wouldn't be, you know, triggering at all. You know, and I don't know if we have to look at, you know, our program. I mean, I definitely think in Marguerite's class, but I guess there's potential when students are selecting topic in any class for someone to have content, be exposed to content. But I also wonder, I don't know, I also wonder how effective is that trigger warning? And it was really interesting. I can't remember, like Nancy, I can't remember which article it was in, but it talked about, oh, here, I'm going to read this paragraph. All this arguing has been taking place over an intervention that hasn't been studied very thoroughly at all. Neither of the two recent studies focused on people with PTSD, for instance, and perhaps certain kind of trigger warnings, and perhaps certain kinds of trigger warnings do work for that population. The author of a more recent study noted that they could find no data directly addressing trigger warnings until the 2018 paper was published. Not the paragraph I want. There was something about a research article where they looked at whether if people had tons of stressors in their life, but they did not perceive those stressors to be, they were just part of life. They weren't particularly good, bad, whatever. They were not more likely to die early. But people who believed that those words had power did demonstrate an earlier death. I think that was sort of the gist of it. And I found that really, you know, kind of fascinating. And I'm in a class right now at Newport for a disaster mental health trauma certificate. And I've been struggling through this whole class because I have a very well, that's life. Let's figure out how to get on with it perspective. And we're talking about disasters and, you know, being in the medical field and having worked in emergency medicine, I'm like, this is just what we do. You do it and you get on with it, because if you broke down with every single patient you had that was traumatic, we would never stop. You just learn how to deal with it. And it feels like there's sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy a little bit. Like if you have, you know, if you anticipate bad things are going to happen because of this, then bad things will happen. But I know that about myself, and I have to try and back myself off to see what the student perspective might be.
Well, and do you think nurses just, I realize this is a generalization, but do you think nurses deal with this differently perhaps than other people? Because one of the things I've noticed is some of my students will select, like, for example, an organization that, you know, we know based on Knoll's adult learning theory that people choose and select topics and work on topics that are personally or professionally relevant to them as adult learners. And one of the things that I've noticed is, you know, a lot of my students will pick, let's say, an agency or an issue because that issue has either professional or personal relevance to them. And like this past session, I had a student pick an organization and it didn't even ask, why did you select this organization? She selected it because this organization has a particular subgroup that deals with gun violence. And 2 years ago, her only child and son was killed by a senseless act of gun violence. She volunteered that information. And so I wonder too, I guess my question is, and this is based on what you just said, Kirsty, you know, it's like when I have a friend who's a physician and she works in an inner city clinic and she sees so much stuff that when her husband complains about something, she's just like, wah, wah, wah. You know, to him, it's a big issue, but to her, it's like, oh, geez, you know, suck it up, buttercup. And so, you know, I'm just wondering if nurses as a generalization are unique in that.
I agree with you, Marguerite. I think maybe depending on the program, we do have students have a different expectation that there are going to be topics that are uncomfortable. And some of those topics, maybe not just for nursing, but in liberal arts, different topics that might cause anxiety, even just like gender topics, climate change, animal rights, like, not that those, maybe they could be trigger warnings, right? Somebody's dog might have been brutally injured, you know, but that issue is, you know, these could be like political issues and different things that you might need to take into consideration if that's in there, if, you know, but then that brings up, might be an academic freedom issue, you know, and is that really limiting? You might want to talk about something, but maybe you don't want to deal with it, that repercussions.
When I taught at New Paltz, it's kind of funny. I'm sorry, Beth, but I'll just say this very briefly. I taught at New Paltz and I was showing we were in the global health class, and I was showing a video of, I think it was called Food Inc. And there is like some pretty graphic stuff in there about animals. And I had a student who was an excellent student, but she was also vegan. And she's like, I cannot watch this. And so, you know, I was like, cool, find some other film that you want to watch that addresses global, you know, stuff, because we're going to, you know, write about this subsequently. And she did, but it didn't, I don't think I had watched it, but it didn't, I don't think I stopped to consider if it would be really offensive to somebody who was vegan. So, yeah.
I think often, I agree with everything that you've all said, but Kirsty in particular, in practice, most of us in nursing are a unique breed, like you say. Instead of getting caught up in the stress and the craziness, we speak calmer. We get everyone under control. And again, even with COVID, instead of getting lost, what do we do after that first week? We talk about resiliency. We talk about strength and collaboration. And even talking about choosing topics. Many of our seasoned RN to BSN students will take the topic when we say, please look at a different role in nursing. I teach in transitions, and they'll do forensic nursing because they've been traumatized. And like you said, again, we can't speak for everybody, but in our nursing major, I think, again, they're prepared and aware that we have to deal with sensitive and stressful topics. And a majority of them really cope with that and use it as a coping or a therapeutic mechanism.
There is a concept that I've been interested in for a while, and it came up in this class called post-traumatic growth, which is using the traumas that you've experienced in a positive way to become, to grow more emotionally and to grow stronger, and develop greater emotional intelligence. And that's a pretty interesting concept.
So I think academic freedom is a good topic to discuss because I've taught a lot of courses at, Penn State, Brandywine, at the community college level. And, I think you do have freedom, but I really do think that everything should be on the syllabus, where I think one of the examples in one of the articles was Quentin Tarantino. And I know this is a big issue in higher ed where you do have the freedom to watch, Quentin Tarantino, but I don't believe it should be, to be determined on the syllabus. Like you can't put TBD. That's just a pet peeve of mine. And, I do think, it should be on the syllabus and every student should receive the syllabus, and people could be critical and say, well, maybe we shouldn't have trigger warnings, but that Quentin Tarantino movie has a rating, it's rated R. And if you look at the rating and what that means, and you wouldn't say just watch a Quentin Tarantino movie and just, and so I think you do have a lot of freedom, but I think it's when you're building your course in the summer. And I think it's just once that course starts, I don't know if you have, for me personally, you can't just throw in movies. You can't just throw in papers. And I think, really just, I think it's about quality and what students should expect.
Right. The syllabus is there to prepare them for what is actually up ahead. So if everything is in there, it is their responsibility to read the syllabus. But if we know that students aren't reading the syllabus, does that mean we should take that into account and adjust our approach?
I don't know. I think students have to be accountable for the syllabus. I mean, there's so much that we can do, and I think that if we don't lead students to, I make a course tour video and I tweak it often. I might use the same one for a couple of times, but then I tweak it. Like right now, I make the course tour video, and I know that there's students who are not looking at it because I specifically say we had to switch from the tab display icon. When you open the book icon, look to the right, you'll find the table of contents. And people email me and say, I don't know where the rubric is, or it talks about the next page or the next tab. And I'm like, you didn't watch the course tours video, take a look at it. You'll figure out where that is real quick. So, I think that students often don't read that. I'll just give you an example. Catherine and I have had some issues with like practicum students not being ready to do practicum. So in the same way that we have had the academic integrity acknowledgement in the course, we have now put a acknowledgement starting in the 600 level courses so that students say, I understand that I have to do practicum. I've looked at the practicum page. I know what's expected of me, kind of statement. And they acknowledge that. Once they acknowledge that, I feel like, but we're going to end up with a page full of acknowledgements, academic integrity policy, trigger warning, practicum. I mean, we could end up with a whole list of things, but I don't think that we shouldn't do it. I just think that students, need to know that inherently in higher education, you're going to come across topics that are difficult. I mean, we have some liberal arts courses. I mean, the biology of AIDS. I mean, I think that the majority of our students are never going to know what AIDS looked like, right, in the 80s. So, I mean, I have a student who works in an HIV/AIDS clinic, and I met with her last night because we were working on something, and I said, how many full-blown AIDS cases do you see? How many are non-detectable? And she said, there's like tiny amounts of full-blown AIDS that they see. Everybody is almost non-detectable. And so in that way, AIDS might not be, a big issue, but there's, plagues in people. I mean, there's some other topics out there in the general ed world that probably have more potentially triggering things, with the exception probably of the epi, Marguerite, sorry to say, but you know, I don't think we have a lot of content in our courses that should be problematic, but could be problematic. But I don't think we should be, I think if we include it somewhere, then the students have to be accountable for looking at it.
Yeah, it has surprised me a bit. It's shown up in policy too, because I mean, look at the politically charged environment that we're in. I mean, who knew the pandemic was gonna, that a public health issue was going to turn into a political issue? But I've also seen students make comments related to immigration. And if I have a student in the class, I had a student in the class that was married to a Mexican immigrant, and she took great offense to that comment. And that just kind of came out, you know, so it can happen in a course like that as well too. I think sometimes, especially in our discussions, and it can happen in voice threads too, where a topic may be selected that could really end up offending another person or whatever. So I think, you know, we just kind of, I guess, have to be aware and then manage it if it happens, manage it as best we can.
That comes down to the netiquette expectation that we have in all of the online work, right? So, you know, do we make sure, because we're talking now about our template for online courses, should that netiquette statement be optional or mandatory? Should trigger warnings be policy or optional for faculty to use? And, you know, so again, that brings up that whole idea. Does it really work? Does it offend some people? You know, so. And it's different in the online setting where you've got an on-campus class where a student can decide to sit in a certain location of the room so they can quickly leave if they need to and not feel like they're put on the spot and everybody's watching them. So.
But I also, yeah, I feel then in the online environment that students might have an ability, I mean, in all honesty, students could self-select to not see that content, right? Because nobody, like, even when they choose, maybe they're in it. The only time I can really think of, like, I have an assignment this time where I've paired students, and if the content of a presentation, like, they're actually grading papers, but if you had, say, students paired up on a presentation to give comments to each other, that would be, in my mind, like the only time that someone would be forced into making a comment to a specific topic. Because in general, none of the content that we present at first glance is probably going to produce a response. Because if someone, for example, in Marguerite's epi class doesn't want to look at human trafficking, in the actual description, there's probably not a lot that's going to trigger them. And then when they're at home, they're in the privacy of their own home, hopefully, unless they're doing work on midnight at work, right? So I think there's more option to sort of remove themselves from that situation, and the likelihood of being exposed to material is less, because if someone's going to get triggered by a presentation on human trafficking, the minute they open a presentation, they go, oh, this is not one I want to watch. I'm going to shut this down. So I think that in the online environment, it's a whole lot easier to meter your own response than it is when you're in a live face-to-face classroom.
Yeah, and that's, I think, why using choice topics is so important, because they can avoid the case study on human trafficking if they want, and pick one on vaccine refusal, and another controversial one could be the opioid one, because everyone's been involved, and certain individuals may even have lost family members to opioid addiction. So, you know, so I think that's why it's so important to, in certain courses, probably more so than others, to provide choices. And they can choose to take that topic because it has personal relevance, or they can choose to avoid it because it could trigger, you know, a trauma response.
I agree. It's almost like twisting it. Instead of saying by presenting triggers, we're coddling. Instead, we're giving them control over what they select. And like we had mentioned already, several of us, that it was interesting that someone who's gone through a trauma actually selects those topics that you might think that they wouldn't want to deal with, but maybe in a therapeutic way, they selected that.
So that's a good example of, you do really want those topics out there. Some people maybe use them to write about it, and it gives them some type of closure, like reflection, you know. So, and one other point that I thought was interesting about how the U.S. Department of Education does expect a learning environment to be, you know, cohesive to learning. You know, we do want to provide a good learning experience for our students. So again, that brings up the whole thing. What can we do to make that learning more positive, prevent the anxiety and panic attacks? So I know Libby had contacted me. She teaches the psych course and the pre-licensure, and she uses a lot of trigger warning in her, I don't know if she puts it in her syllabus or in each week, but it's real important, very stressful. She's found that out, so.
Well, I can imagine. I was thinking of a lot of the psychology courses that either students are required to take or that are elective. And there are some really intimate and sensitive topics.
Yeah, that's the way it is, I think, in the criminal justice department too.
In this course I'm taking, they've had several times where the professor has, the course is completely lacking in so many areas, but not trigger warnings. Let me just say that. You know, it's interesting because we're talking about being like disaster mental health counselors in disaster settings, right? So you have to know going into that there's going to be times where you might be exposed to things, death, or, you know, immense grief and loss on so many levels. But the trigger warnings were still there. And there was like, oh, and in the very first week that we were introducing ourselves, you know, people were saying, oh, well, you know, how do you take care of yourself? And I'm like, I mean, I get it, but I just was like, well, wait a minute, like the whole thrust, you're expecting that when people are exposed in these settings that they really just fall apart. It was interesting. I heard a podcast, this is sort of tangentially related, but I was thinking about this in terms of how nurses deal with this stuff. I listened to a podcast called On Being by Krista Tippett. And she interviewed Bessel van der Kolk, who's a well-known trauma. He's a PhD psychologist. He's done tons of research. And he was talking about the, not most recently in Puerto Rico, but a storm in Puerto Rico that devastated things. And how people in the community just started helping each other, and how movement really helps trauma. And it wasn't until FEMA came in and told people what they could and couldn't do that people started having much more significant difficulties, because all of a sudden the role of helping others and feeling like you had some purpose was taken away. And then PTSD symptoms really started showing up in people when they could no longer fulfill that role of helping each other. And it sort of reminds me that, you know, as nurses, I think we do, it's evident in the class. I'm the only psych person in this class, and there's a chasm between my thinking and their thinking. And so it's been a really interesting experience. And I think that we as nurses, we know how to pick up and move on because we know how to help the next person and how to think a little bit more globally about witnessing trauma. I mean, there are things that we have seen, that all of us have seen probably, that stay with us forever. But I don't feel badly about it because I feel like I did what I knew how to do and what I could do, and I gave it my best, right? And though it stays with me, those images are easily recalled, they don't impact me in a negative way. I want so much for people to sort of learn that skill, but I know that it's not going to happen for everybody. But I do have that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy kind of sense a little bit with all of this discussion. Like, are we teaching people how to be victims versus survivors? I don't know.
Well, and here's another question. Do you think that, I mean, I think of the pandemic and how the US response to the pandemic is. I mean, this hasn't occurred in 100 years that we've had a pandemic like this. And do you think that we've dealt with it differently in the US than they have in other countries, because other countries are more used to these kinds of things going on in their country? And
Well, I mean, my family's in the UK, right? And although we're both, well, America pretends to be an English-speaking country, but but although we're both English-speaking countries, right? And you're not talking about being a developing nation. I've been talking to my dad, you know, so I've seen hundreds of COVID patients in the last year, either suspected or actual, right, in urgent care. And also, you know, have talked with my dad quite a bit about those experiences, and the sentiment in the UK is a very different sentiment that's here. People in the US are much more about what's my right to not wear a mask, what's my right to continue to congregate. Whereas in the UK, although there might be some vocal dissidence, there is not the same level of refusal to believe what this is. You know, lockdown is lockdown. I mean, you know, I just think there's a different perspective. So, I mean, even though it's a country in terms of living that's similar to ours, it's a much smaller nation, but I think that the perspective of sort of the me versus us, you know, in the US, sort of that sentiment. I think that's a broad generalization, but I do think there's a difference in perspective in the country in terms of how do we deal with this versus what's best for me and what do I believe about this. And I think, you know, I think internationally there are some differences.
So then we might actually see that different among different students and the diversity of our courses. And then obviously our personal experiences are going to inform how we're going to approach this issue. Right?
Well, and one of the things I've learned, and I mentioned this in the last faculty meeting, is because I'm seeing more non-nursing students in my allied health courses, there are some of these students that are first generation. They're going to be the first person in their family to graduate from high school, graduate from college. And they are very family oriented in their mindset. And also they're under more, what I'm learning is they're under more of a financial pressure as that student, because they're not working as a nurse employed in a relatively good paying job. So they've got they've got the push to graduate, they've got the push to push through taking 21 credit hours, but they also are working 40 hours a week, night shift, in a job that's not making them a whole lot of money. And it's been such an eye-opening experience, you know, having email and Zoom meetings with these students. And it's just opened up a whole kind of thing that I haven't seen. And this is the diverse student body that we have.
So
I-
where,
I think-
go ahead.
I'm sorry, Jen, I think the discussion just sort of, I mean, there's huge diversity in this topic. I mean, when it really comes down to it, look at what we're talking about versus, you know, the actual trigger warnings. And I think like many of these topics, it's multifaceted. You know, if we had to say, like, if we had to sort of come to a conclusion at the end of like this chat and say, would you include a trigger warning? I'd probably say yes, but I don't know where we would put that to make it meaningful. I mean, what is the, I agree that there's not a big deal about including it in terms of the workload for us, but I wonder where we would put it to make it meaningful in our courses.
I believe it goes in our weekly announcement, because even though we want to hold our students accountable to read the syllabus, if we know they're not reading it, I think we need to put it where we at least have a better chance of them reading it.
And I think most of us keep our announcements, right? I mean, I have a Word doc with, you know, week 1 and then 1, 2, 3, right? And then I have my standard, you know, welcome to the course, you know, then I have my standard, you know, extra, you know, tips for success kind of one. And, you know, I think that, you know, copying and pasting that and setting it up to release when we, you know, open the course is not a big deal. And I think that we could make a pretty general statement that inherently we may touch on topics. Again, I don't think in some courses, but, you know, because of the choices we ask students to make, it might be in many courses, but I do think that there's an opportunity to, you know, to put one there if people, you know, felt like it. I don't know.
Nancy, do you see any need for something like this to share when you're speaking with new students? I wonder if that's a good place to maybe discuss difficult topics that are going to come up in the next 2 to 4 years.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it sort of as an orientation type approach, but I wonder if even in UNIV that might be a useful topic to cover, even if briefly. Yeah, I don't, you know, initially with students, I don't tend to get into that deep of a level of a conversation where I would be aware of certain triggering topics for them necessarily, but it's just, you know, in reflecting on this conversation, I remember maybe last year I had a student who lost her daughter unexpectedly and then wanted to sign up for the death and dying course, which she ended up doing and feeling like it was a very positive experience. Again, going back to that sort of therapeutic self, you know, opt-in type of choice, but the fact that we do cover so many sensitive topics in this program, I think is a positive. And I do think that what Kirsty was saying earlier, just handling students gently, not academically necessarily, but just being aware, I think is half the battle with this, whether we choose to do trigger warnings in a syllabus or in weekly announcements. I think students generally have a sense of whether or not their instructors and those folks who they're talking to just have a sensitivity and sense of care toward them. And I think that goes just as far as a content warning sometimes.
I have to say though that I'm sitting here as educators, we're talking about this and I'm saying, well, man, we should be having, I'm like saving your email with all of these links in it, probably going to download these articles and be like, where can we fit this in? Like, I think we've got, you know, I've got a discussion. I don't know it would fit in measurement and evaluation, but, you know, I've got a discussion that I'm looking at sort of updating and replacing, and it does, you know, it's a hot topic these days, and it might not be a bad thing to include in a MSN discussion for the ed students, because I think it could lead to some interesting, you know, conversation.
Absolutely. And what we've discussed, even as far as if students are aware, it's interesting some of their choices that they'll make, meaning something's tough and they've had a rough experience, but they'd rather do it versus choosing not to. Even when I taught skills, very beginning nursing classes, sometimes I would simply say, not everything in nursing is glamorous when we're talking about suction and Foley catheters, et cetera. But sometimes, like you said, with choices, I think it's helpful for the students.
And I think some of the cons, some people look at the trigger warnings as it gives students an out to not participate in a certain activity. It's not that difficult for faculty to give an alternate video, or students can find another reading on the topic. So, you know, so there's workarounds around the negatives to a trigger warning where students might just not participate. So. This was a wonderful discussion. Great ideas and points. Great.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to have these, you know, I mean, even sometimes I think about pedagogy or just, you know, topics in academia. It's nice to have these, you know, kind of conversations, because we're often a little isolated in our offices at home behind our screens. So it's good to chat about these. Thanks for arranging it, Jamie.
Yeah. I thought the discussion we had in the college group was amazing. It really kind of spurred on the idea to share it here. So, and if anybody has ideas for the fall, let me know and we can get something going. I'll be sending things out later, but yeah. Any other thoughts or points to make?
You ended up muted again, Jamie.
Oh, I'm okay. Sorry. Okay. Well, I think this concludes our little chat. Thank you so much for attending. And I will post this recording. And I also have some notes that I took from all 4 of the articles. So I'll also post that if you want to scan through it. So I thought it was interesting kind of organizing some of the points they made. So.
Ooh, thank you.
Oh, excellent.
Great.
Nice to see everybody.
All right.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Good day. Bye-bye.